The morning sun cast harsh shadows through the Venetian blinds of Colonel Morrison's office as Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez stood outside his door, her right hand gripping the brass handle while her left clutched a wrinkled medical exemption form. The paper felt damp from her sweating palm, though whether from pain or anticipation, she couldn't tell. Through the frosted glass, she could see Morrison's bulky silhouette hunched over his desk, probably reviewing the morning's PT roster and looking for his next victim. Vasquez had been dreading this moment for 3 days, ever since Dr. Martinez had handed her the exemption with that sympathetic look that said everything and nothing at once. She tried every alternative modified exercises, different timing, even attempting the full routine yesterday morning until the searing pain in her reconstructed shoulder blade had dropped her to her knees behind the barracks. But Morrison's reputation preceded him like a storm front. No excuses, no exceptions, no mercy. The base had been buzzing about his latest crusade against what he called malingering weaklings ever since he'd arrived 6 months ago. Just last week, he'd forced Private Chen to complete a 5-mile run on a sprained ankle, resulting in a stress fracture that would sideline the kid for months. The week before that, he'd publicly humiliated Sergeant Williams for requesting light duty after a concussion, calling him a soft-skulled embarrassment in front of the entire company. Vasquez knocked twice, sharp and military precise. "Enter!" Morrison's voice boomed through the door like artillery fire. She stepped inside, her posture automatically snapping to attention despite the protest from her damaged nerves. Morrison didn't look up from his paperwork immediately, a power play she'd seen him use on countless others. The office reeked of stale coffee and Colonel's signature cologne, something expensive that couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of a man who sweated authority and thrived on intimidation. Staff Sergeant Vasquez reporting as ordered. "Sir." Morrison finally raised his head, his pale blue eyes scanning her from boots to beret with the practiced disdain of a man who'd made a career of finding fault. He was younger than she'd expected when he first arrived, maybe 45, with the kind of soft features that suggested he'd spent more time behind desks than in foxholes. His uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, every ribbon and medal positioned with mathematical precision. "Ah, yes, Vasquez. I hear you've got some creative excuse for missing PT this morning." He leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled like a judge preparing to deliver sentence. "Let me guess, mysterious back pain? Sudden onset migraine? Or maybe you've developed one of those convenient allergies to physical exertion?" Vasquez extended the medical form with steady hands. "Sir, I have a documented medical exemption from..." "Documented?" Morrison's laugh was sharp and humorless. He snatched the paper from her hand without looking at it, his eyes never leaving her face. "You know what I think about documentation, Sergeant? I think it's become a crutch for soldiers who've forgotten what it means to push through adversity." Through the office's large window, Vasquez could see other personnel beginning to gather in the hallway. Word traveled fast on a military base, especially when Colonel Morrison was about to make another example of someone. She recognized Corporal Jenkins and Specialist Rodriguez among the growing crowd, their faces pressed against the glass like spectators at a car accident. Morrison held up the medical form, making a show of examining it with exaggerated skepticism. "Dr. Martinez, huh? That bleeding heart has been handing out exemptions like candy since I got here. Probably thinks he's doing you all some kind of favor, enabling your weakness. Sir, if you would just read that..." "I don't need to read anything." Morrison's fist slammed down on his desk, sending his coffee mug jumping. Dark liquid sloshed across a stack of personnel files. "What I need is soldiers who understand that the enemy doesn't care about your aches and pains. You think the Taliban is going to give you a timeout because your shoulder hurts?" The crowd outside had grown larger. Vasquez could see Master Sergeant Chen no relation to the private. Morrison had injured positioning himself where he could see and hear everything. Chen had been on base for 15 years and had a reputation for protecting his people from overzealous officers. His presence both comforted and worried her. Morrison stood up, his chair rolling backward until it hit the wall with a soft thud. At 6'2", he towered over Vasquez's 5'6" frame, another intimidation tactic from his playbook. "You know what I think happened here, Sergeant? I think you've gotten comfortable. I think you've forgotten that being a soldier means sacrifice, means pushing your body beyond its limits." He began pacing behind his desk, his voice rising with each word. "I've seen your type before, soldiers who cruise through their careers looking for the easy way out. Well, let me tell you something about the easy way out. It gets people killed." Vasquez felt her jaw muscles tighten, a familiar tension that had nothing to do with her physical injuries. She'd been called many things in her 12 years of service, but never a coward, never someone who took the easy way out. The accusation hit her like a physical blow, stirring something dark and dangerous in her chest. "Sir, with respect, you don't know anything about." "Don't know anything?" Morrison's voice reached a crescendo that could probably be heard 3 offices down. "I know that real soldiers don't come crying to their commanding officers with doctor's notes. I know that real soldiers understand that pain is temporary, but quitting lasts forever." He grabbed the medical exemption and, without breaking eye contact, tore it cleanly in half. Then in half again. The pieces fluttered to his desk like wounded birds. "There's your documentation, Sergeant. Now you can report to PT like everyone else. Or you can explain to a court-martial board why you think you're too special to follow orders." The hallway outside had gone completely silent. Even through the closed door, Vasquez could feel the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes watching this confrontation unfold. Some of those people knew her story, knew what she'd been through, what she'd sacrificed. Others only knew her reputation, the whispered stories that followed her like shadows. Morrison leaned forward, his hands planted on his desk, his face flushed with the righteousness of a man who believed his own propaganda. "You see, Vasquez, this is exactly what's wrong with today's military. Too many soldiers looking for excuses, too many doctors enabling weakness, too many people who've forgotten that being a warrior means embracing discomfort." Vasquez stared at the torn pieces of her medical exemption scattered across Morrison's desk like confetti from a celebration. She wasn't invited to. Dr. Martinez had spent 20 minutes explaining why those exercises could cause permanent damage to her reconstructed shoulder, why the metal plates and screws holding her together needed time to fully integrate with her bone structure. But Morrison didn't want to hear about medical necessity. He wanted to make a point, to establish dominance, to show everyone watching that he was the kind of leader who didn't tolerate weakness in any form. "So what's it going to be, Sergeant?" Morrison's voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "Are you going to stop wasting my time with this pathetic charade, or do I need to start paperwork for your discharge?" Vasquez looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes steady and unblinking. She could feel the weight of decision settling on her shoulders like a familiar pack. She'd spent 3 days dreading this confrontation, trying to find a way to avoid it, hoping that somehow Morrison would be reasonable. But reasonable wasn't in his vocabulary. Her hands moved slowly to her jacket zipper, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried the kind of authority that came from places Morrison had never been. "You want the truth, sir?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Morrison's confident smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second as something in Vasquez's tone registered, a shift from deference to something far more dangerous. The crowd outside had pressed closer to the glass, sensing that whatever was about to happen would be talked about for years to come. The truth? Morrison recovered quickly, his voice dripping with condescension. The truth is that you're a malingerer trying to avoid your duties with fake medical." Vasquez's zipper made a sharp metallic sound as she pulled it down in one fluid motion. The noise cut through Morrison's words like a blade, and suddenly the office fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, the same way she'd once field-stripped weapons in complete darkness muscle. Memory born from necessity. The jacket hit the floor with a soft whisper. Morrison's mouth was still open. Mid-sentence, when Vasquez grabbed the hem of her olive-drab undershirt and pulled it over her head without hesitation. What was revealed beneath made the colonel's words die in his throat like a strangled prayer. Her torso was a roadmap of trauma, a canvas painted in shades of pink and white scar tissue that told a story no medical textbook could adequately describe. The burns started at her collarbone and cascaded down her chest and arms like frozen lightning. The skin puckered and twisted where it had melted and been painstakingly reconstructed. But it was her back that truly silenced the room when she turned, slightly a landscape of surgical scars crisscrossing the burn damage, marking where surgeons had worked for 18 hours to rebuild. A shoulder blade from titanium and hope dot through the office window. Vasquez could see the reflection of faces pressed against the glass, their expressions shifting from curiosity to horror to something approaching reverence. Corporal Jenkins had gone pale, his hand unconsciously moving to cover his mouth. Specialist Rodriguez was staring with the wide-eyed look of someone seeing combat footage for the first time. "Kandahar Province, Afghanistan," Vasquez said, her voice steady and clinical, as if she were briefing a mission instead of displaying the wreckage of her own body. "March 15th, 2 years ago. Our convoy hit an IED en route Falcon, about 30 clicks outside the wire." Morrison tried to speak, but only managed a strangled sound that might have been an attempt at words. His face had gone from flushed red to ashen gray, the color of old concrete. The blast flipped our lead vehicle, a up-armored Humvee carrying 6 soldiers. Vasquez's fingers traced one of the larger scars on her shoulder, a gesture so casual it was almost obscene. The fuel tank ruptured on impact. Diesel doesn't just burn. Colonel, it cooks everything it touches. She turned fully around, giving Morrison and the growing crowd outside a complete view of the damage. The burns on her back were worse than the front, if such a thing was possible. They formed a pattern that suggested she'd been lying on her stomach when the fire reached her, protecting something or someone beneath her body. "Private First Class Danny Morrison, no relation to you." Sarah was trapped under the vehicle when it rolled. 19 years old, from some small town in Iowa. Kid used to show everyone pictures of his girlfriend back home. Talked about proposing when he got back from deployment. Vasquez's voice never wavered, but something in her eyes had gone distant, as if she were seeing through the office walls to a place thousands of miles and 2 years away. Master Sergeant Chun had appeared in the doorway, having pushed through the crowd. His weathered face was grim, and Vasquez could see recognition in his eyes. He'd been there that day, part of the rescue team that had found her 6 hours later. "The fire spread faster than we anticipated," she continued, her clinical tone making the horror somehow worse. Specialist Rodriguez, different Rodriguez than the one watching us now, was conscious but pinned. Sergeant Williams had a compound fracture in his leg, but was trying to crawl away from the flames. Private Chun was unconscious, bleeding from a head wound. Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sergeant, you don't need to." "Don't need to what, sir?" Vasquez's eyes snapped back to the present, fixing on Morrison with laser intensity. "Don't need to explain why I can't do push-ups? Don't need to justify why certain movements feel like someone's driving hot nails through my reconstructed shoulder blade." She reached behind her back, her fingers finding a particularly prominent scar that ran from her spine to her armpit. This is where they had to remove 3 pieces of shrapnel that had fused with my scapula. The surgeon said it was like trying to separate melted plastic from bone. The crowd outside had grown to include nearly half the base personnel who weren't currently on duty. Word was spreading through the barracks like wildfire, and soldiers were abandoning their morning routines to witness what was already being whispered about as the most epic takedown in military history. I stayed in that burning vehicle for 6 hours. "Colonel," Vasquez said, her voice gaining strength with each word. 6 hours of pulling bodies out while my uniform melted to my skin. 6 hours of breathing superheated air that seared my lungs. 6 hours of feeling my flesh cook while I tried to save my brothers and sisters. Master Sergeant Chun stepped fully into the office, his presence adding weight to Vasquez's words. "I was part of the rescue team that found her," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years in combat zones. "When we arrived, she was still conscious, still trying to perform CPR on Private Morrison, even though her hands were burned down to the bone." Morrison's chair creaked as he sank into it, the fight completely drained out of him. His eyes couldn't seem to focus on any one part of Vasquez's scarred torso, as if his brain was refusing to process the full extent of what he was seeing. "The doctors said I should have died from shock within the first hour," Vasquez continued, reaching for her undershirt. "They said the only thing that kept me conscious was adrenaline and pure stubborn refusal to let my people die. They rebuilt me with titanium plates, skin grafts from my legs, and about 2 years of physical therapy that made basic training look like a spa day." She pulled the shirt back over her head, the fabric settling over her scars like a curtain closing on a tragedy. But the image was burned into everyone's memory, now Morrison's, the crowd's, and most importantly, her own. "So when Dr. Martinez tells me that certain exercises could cause permanent damage to the hardware holding my shoulder together," she said, tucking the shirt into her pants with military precision, "I tend to take his medical opinion seriously, because unlike some people in this room, he's actually seen what's underneath this uniform." Morrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The confident, intimidating officer who had torn up her medical exemption just minutes ago had been replaced by a man who looked like he'd been hit by a truck carrying his own mortality. Vasquez bent to retrieve her jacket, the movement causing her to wince slightly, a reminder that the pain was real, constant, and earned through sacrifice that Morrison couldn't begin to comprehend. "Now, sir," she said, straightening to attention with her jacket draped over her arm, "do you still think I'm malingering?" The silence in Colonel Morrison's office stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Morrison sat frozen in his chair, his mouth working soundlessly as he stared at the woman standing before him, a woman he'd just accused of cowardice, who had literally stripped away any pretense to reveal the price of her heroism. The torn pieces of her medical exemption lay scattered across his desk like evidence of his own ignorance. Through the window, the crowd had swelled to nearly 40 personnel, their faces pressed against the glass in a mixture of awe and anticipation. Someone had clearly spread the word through the base's informal communication network, because soldiers were still arriving, drawn by the magnetic pull of witnessing their notorious colonel finally meet his match. Master Sergeant Chun stepped further into the office, his weathered face carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much combat to be impressed by desk warriors. "Colonel Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from leading men through actual hell, "I think there are some things you need to understand about Staff Sergeant Vasquez." Morrison's eyes darted between Chen and Vasquez, his face cycling through emotions like a broken traffic light: confusion, embarrassment, and the dawning realization that he had just committed career suicide in front of half his command. "Master Sergeant, this is a private," Morrison began, but Chun cut him off with a look that could have stopped incoming artillery. "Sir, with respect. Nothing about this is private anymore. Chun gestured toward the window where phones had appeared in several hands. Their cameras pointed directly at the unfolding drama. And since you seem to have some misconceptions about the soldiers standing in front of you, I think it's time you heard the rest of the story. Vasquez remained at attention, her jacket still draped over her arm, but something in her posture had shifted. The defensive stance was gone, replaced by the bearing of someone who had nothing left to hide and nothing left to lose. Chun moved to stand beside her, his presence lending additional gravity to his words. What Staff Sergeant Vasquez didn't tell you, sir, is that she was awarded the Silver Star for her actions that day. The citation reads like something out of a movie, except it's all true. And I was there to witness most of it. Morrison's face went from gray to green, the color of someone realizing they had just insulted a Medal of Honor recipient at a veterans gathering. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee mug, then thought better of it when he realized everyone would see the shaking. She didn't mention that she refused medical evacuation 3 times because there were still soldiers unaccounted for. Chun continued, his voice gaining momentum like a freight train. She didn't tell you that she performed field surgery on Specialist Rodriguez with a combat knife and a first aid kit while her own skin was literally falling off her arms. Through the window, Vasquez could see more senior personnel arriving. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes from the medical unit had pushed through the crowd, his face grim as he took in the scene. Behind him, she spotted Command Sergeant Major Williams, the same Williams who had been in her convoy that day, whose life she had saved at the cost of her own flesh. She didn't mention, Chun's voice rose slightly, that when the medevac finally arrived, she had to be sedated because she kept trying to get back to the wreckage to look for survivors. Even though we'd already confirmed all personnel were accounted for, Morrison tried to stand, perhaps thinking he could regain some control of the situation, but his legs seemed unwilling to support him. He sank back into his chair, the leather creaking like old bones. Command Sergeant Major Williams had somehow made it through the crowd and now stood in the doorway, his presence commanding immediate attention. At 52, Williams was a legend on the base, a man who had served in every major conflict of the past 3 decades, and whose word carried more weight than most colonels. Orders, Sergeant Major Williams. Morrison croaked, his voice barely audible. I know exactly what you were doing. Colonel, Williams said, his voice carrying the kind of cold fury that made grown men reconsider their life choices. I was watching through the window. We all were. Williams stepped into the office, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. You see, Colonel, Staff Sergeant Vasquez saved my life that day in Kandahar. Pulled me out of that burning vehicle when I was unconscious and bleeding out from a compound fracture. Carried me 50 meters through enemy fire to the casualty collection point. Morrison's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He looked like a man watching his own execution. But here's the thing that really gets me, Williams continued, his eyes never leaving Morrison's face. She never talks about it, never mentions the Silver Star, never brings up the fact that she spent 8 months in Walter Reed, getting rebuilt piece by piece. Never asks for special treatment or recognition. Vasquez shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the attention, but Williams wasn't finished. You want to know what kind of soldier she is, Colonel? Last month, when Private Chun, your Private Chun, the one you forced to run on a sprained ankle, was struggling with his PT scores, she volunteered to work with him on her own time. Designed a training program that accommodated his injury while still meeting standards. The crowd outside had gone completely silent, hanging on every word. Several soldiers had their phones out, recording what was clearly going to become legendary base folklore. She's been doing that for months, Williams continued, helping soldiers who are dealing with injuries, teaching them how to maintain their fitness without causing permanent damage. All on her own time, all without recognition, all while dealing with her own pain. Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. I didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't want to know, William shot back. You were so busy playing the tough guy, so focused on your reputation as a hard-ass, that you never bothered to learn about the people under your command. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had pushed his way into the office, his medical insignia catching the light. "Colonel Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years putting soldiers back together. "I think you should know that Staff Sergeant Vasquez's medical exemption wasn't just a recommendation. It was a direct order from the Chief of Orthopedic Surgery at Walter Reed." Morrison's face went through another color change, this time settling on a sickly yellow. "A direct order?" "The hardware in her shoulder is still integrating," Hayes explained, his tone clinical but pointed. "Certain exercises could cause the titanium plates to shift, potentially requiring additional surgery. Dr. Martinez didn't just suggest she avoid those exercises. He was following explicit instructions from some of the best military surgeons in the country. The weight of his mistake was settling on Morrison like a collapsing building. He had just publicly humiliated a decorated war hero, ignored direct medical orders, and done it all in front of an audience that included some of the most respected personnel on the base. Vasquez finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Morrison nodded weakly, no longer trusting his voice. "I didn't come here looking for a fight," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "I came here following proper channels, with proper documentation, requesting accommodation for a service-connected injury. You chose to make this personal." She gestured toward the window where the crowd continued to grow. "Now it's not just personal anymore, is it, sir?" Morrison followed her gaze to the sea of faces pressed against the glass, many of them holding phones, all of them witnesses to his spectacular fall from grace. "The question now," Vasquez continued, "is what you're going to do about it." The silence that followed Vasquez's question stretched like the moment before an explosion. Colonel Morrison sat in his chair, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making, torn medical documents scattered across his desk. A room full of witnesses to his humiliation, and the growing realization that his military career was hanging by a thread thinner than spider silk dot outside the window. The crowd had grown to include what seemed like half the base. Word had spread through the barracks, the mess hall, and the motor pool with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. Soldiers who had been victims of Morrison's previous tirades were now watching their tormentor face his own reckoning, their expressions ranging from satisfaction to outright glee. Morrison's hands trembled as he reached for his desk phone, then stopped, realizing that any call he made now would be witnessed by dozens of people. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the faces of Master Sergeant Chun, Command Sergeant Major Williams, and Lieutenant Colonel Hayesman, whose combined experience and respect on the base far exceeded his own. Morrison's voice cracked like a teenager's. He cleared his throat and tried again. I should. What you should do, Command Sergeant Major Williams said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades in uniform, is start by apologizing to Staff Sergeant Vasquez, publicly, right here, right now, in front of everyone who witnessed your accusations. Morrison's face cycled through emotions like a slot machine, pride warring with pragmatism, ego battling with survival instinct. He could see his reflection in the window behind Vasquez, and what stared back was a man who had just committed professional suicide in the most public way possible. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, Morrison began, his voice barely above a whisper. The crowd outside pressed closer to the glass, straining to hear. I owe you an apology. Louder, sir, Williams commanded. I don't think everyone heard you. Morrison's jaw, worked silently for a moment before he found his voice again. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez, I formally apologize for my conduct today. I was wrong to question your medical exemption, wrong to accuse you of malingering, and wrong to tear up your documentation." Vasquez remained at attention, her expression unreadable. She had put her jacket back on, but everyone in the room, and half the base, now knew what lay beneath the fabric. The image of her scars had been burned into their collective memory, a testament to sacrifice that Morrison's words could never diminish. Furthermore, Morrison continued, his voice gaining strength as he realized that his only path forward was complete capitulation. "I want to personally ensure that you receive the proper medical care and accommodations you deserve." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes stepped forward. "Colonel, if I may suggest, Staff Sergeant Vasquez should be immediately transferred to my medical unit as a liaison for Wounded Warrior Services. Our experience and expertise would be invaluable in helping other soldiers navigate their recovery." Morrison nodded eagerly, grasping at any opportunity to make amends. "Yes, absolutely. Consider it done." But Vasquez held up a hand, speaking for the first time since her devastating question. "With respect, sir, I'd like to make a different suggestion." The room fell silent again, everyone hanging on her words. "I'd like to propose the establishment of a new protocol for handling medical exemptions and accommodations," she said, her voice steady and professional. "Something that ensures no soldier's service-connected injuries are ever questioned without proper review and understanding." Morrison blinked, clearly not expecting this response. Yes, of course. What did you have in mind?" Vasquez glanced at Master Sergeant Chun, who nodded encouragingly. "A mandatory briefing for all command personnel on recognizing and accommodating service-connected injuries. Training on how to read and understand medical documentation. And most importantly, a requirement that any disputes over medical exemptions be handled through proper medical channels, not through intimidation or public humiliation." Command Sergeant Major Williams smiled for the first time since entering the office. "I think that's an excellent idea, Staff Sergeant. In fact, I think it should be named after you, the Vasquez Protocol." "No, sir," Vasquez replied immediately. "If we're going to name it after anyone, it should be named after the soldiers who didn't make it home to need accommodations. The ones who gave everything so that the rest of us could have the chance to heal." The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Morrison looked down at his hands, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of what he had almost destroyed with his ignorance and arrogance. "There's something else," Vasquez continued. "I want to work with the base physical therapy unit to develop modified PT programs for soldiers with service-connected injuries. Programs that maintain fitness standards while respecting medical limitations." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes nodded enthusiastically. "The medical unit would be honored to have your input, Staff Sergeant. Your first-hand experience would be invaluable." Morrison cleared his throat, his voice stronger now as he began to see a path toward redemption. "I'll make the calls today. Full transfer to the medical unit, with a promotion to Sergeant First Class, effective immediately." "That's not necessary, sir," Vasquez replied. "I don't want advancement because of this incident. I want to earn my promotions the same way I always have." Williams chuckled, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "Staff Sergeant, you've been earning that promotion for 2 years. The paperwork has been sitting on someone's desk because they were too busy playing politics to recognize excellence when they saw it. Through the window." The crowd had begun to disperse as word spread that the confrontation was winding down. But Vasquez could see that many of the soldiers were lingering, talking in small groups, their expressions animated. She knew that within hours, every detail of this encounter would be known throughout the base, and probably beyond. Morrison stood up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez, I want you to know that this incident has been educational for me. I've learned that true leadership means understanding the people under your command, not just commanding them. He walked around his desk, stopping directly in front of her. I also want you to know that I'll be recommending you for the base's Outstanding Service Award. And I'll be personally writing a letter to your permanent file documenting your professionalism and dedication in the face of my poor judgment. Vasquez studied his face for a moment, looking for signs of sincerity. What she saw was a man who had been fundamentally changed by the last hour, someone who had looked into the abyss of his own ignorance and found it wanting. "Thank you, sir," she said simply. "I accept your apology." Morrison extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Vasquez shook it. The gesture was witnessed by everyone remaining in the room, a symbolic end to a confrontation that had revealed more about character than any fitness test ever could. As the senior personnel began to file out of the office, Williams paused at the door. "Colonel," he said, his voice carrying a note of warning, "I hope you understand that this base is watching you now. We all are. The soldiers under your command deserve better than what they've been getting." Morrison nodded, his face grave. "I understand, Sergeant Major, and they'll get it." After everyone had left, Morrison sat alone in his office, staring at the torn pieces of medical documentation on his desk. He gathered them carefully, as if they were fragments of something precious, and placed them in an envelope. Tomorrow, he would personally deliver them to Dr. Martinez with his own apology. But tonight, he would go home and think about what it meant to be a leader and what it cost to be a hero. Outside, Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez walked across the base toward the medical unit, her jacket zipped up against the morning chill. Behind her, she left a changed command structure, a new protocol that would protect future soldiers, and the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful weapon in a soldier's arsenal was simply the truth. The scars beneath her uniform would always be there, a permanent reminder of the price of service. But today, for the first time in 2 years, they had served a purpose beyond her own pain. They had become a shield for others who needed protection from those who had never learned the true cost of freedom.